It all started innocently enough. Emily had just landed her dream job at a prestigious advertising firm. The office was a modern marvel, filled with creativity and energy. But there was one colleague who stood out from the rest, Jack. He was quiet, reserved, always watching. At first, Emily thought he was just shy, but soon she realized there was something deeply unsettling about him. Jack had a way of appearing out of nowhere, silently slipping into rooms, always with an eerie smile. Emily noticed him lingering by her desk, staring at her with unblinking eyes. It wasn't just her imagination, others noticed it too, but they brushed it off as harmless eccentricity. As weeks turned into months, Jack's behavior grew more disturbing. Emily would find unsettling notes on her desk, drawings of eyes, cryptic messages that seemed like gibberish but felt personal. She reported it to HR, but without concrete evidence, they couldn't take any action. Her friends at work tried to comfort her, but the fear was beginning to consume her. One evening, as Emily was working late, she heard a noise in the otherwise empty office. Her heart pounded as she walked through the darkened hallways, the sound of her footsteps echoing ominously. She reached the break room and froze. Jack was there, standing in the shadows, watching her. "What are you doing here, Jack?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to make sure you were safe," he replied, stepping closer. "It's dangerous to be here alone." Emily's instincts screamed at her to run. She quickly gathered her things and left, but Jack's words echoed in her mind. That night, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Days passed, and Jack's behavior escalated. He began showing up at places Emily frequented outside of work: her gym, her favorite cafe, even her apartment building. She felt trapped, her every move monitored. Desperation gnawed at her, but without proof, she couldn't do anything. Then came the night that changed everything. Emily was at home, trying to relax after a particularly stressful day. She was alone in her apartment, or so she thought. Emily was watching a movie in her room, the soft glow of the screen casting shadows on the walls. Suddenly, she heard a creak in the floorboards downstairs. Her blood ran cold. She muted the TV and listened intently. There it was again, a distinct creaking, followed by the sound of footsteps. Her heart pounded as she tiptoed to the closet, slipping inside and closing the door just enough to leave a small gap. Through it, she could see the hallway dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through the windows. She waited, barely breathing, as the footsteps grew louder, closer. Her worst fears were confirmed when Jack appeared, moving stealthily through her home, a knife glinting in his hand. Emily stifled a gasp, her eyes wide with terror. Jack moved into the bedroom, his eyes scanning the room. He methodically searched, checking under the bed, opening drawers. As he bent down to look under the bed again, Emily seized the moment. She slipped out of the closet and dashed to the next room, locking the door behind her. Her hands trembled as she picked up the landline phone on the desk. She dialed 911, whispering urgently for help. Just as she began to speak, the line went dead and the lights flickered out. Jack had cut the electricity. Complete silence enveloped the room. Emily sank onto a chair, her body shaking with fear. She strained to hear any sound, but there was nothing. Suddenly, she heard a faint tapping. She turned slowly, her heart nearly stopping as she saw Jack outside the window. He smiled and then shattered the glass with his knife. She screamed and ran for the front door, but it was locked. The keys were with Jack. He was now inside, standing on the stairway, laughing as he descended toward her. "You can't escape, Emily," he taunted. "There's nowhere to run." Desperate, Emily rushed to the basement, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. She could hear Jack's footsteps above, searching for her. Little did he know, there was a passageway in the basement that led to the backyard. She crawled through the narrow tunnel, her hands trembling, and emerged outside. She ran to a neighbor's house, banging on the door and pleading for help. They let her in, and she called the police. When they arrived, Jack was nowhere to be found. The house was empty, with signs of forced entry, but no proof that it was Jack. Emily was safe, but the terror didn't end there. Jack was still out there, somewhere, watching. The police conducted a thorough investigation, but Jack had vanished without a trace. Emily's life was forever changed. She moved to a new city, changed her name, and tried to rebuild her life, but the fear never left her. Every creak in the night, every shadow in the corner of her eye, brought back memories of Jack. She knew he was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment. And so, she lived her life in constant vigilance, haunted by the colleague who watched. Sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who walk among us, hiding in plain sight. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and never ignore the signs.
Next story.
Moving into a new apartment had been a big step for Lily. She was excited about her fresh start in a new city, a new job, and new opportunities. Her new roommate, Emily, seemed friendly enough, albeit a bit peculiar. Emily was quiet, often kept to herself, and had an unsettling habit of staring off into space for long periods. At first, Lily thought it was just Emily's introverted nature. But soon, strange things began happening in the apartment. Objects moved on their own, lights flickered, and there was a constant feeling of being watched. Lily brushed it off as her imagination, but deep down, she felt an increasing sense of dread. One night, Lily was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. She rushed to Emily's room to find her standing in the middle of the room, eyes wide open, but seemingly asleep. Emily was muttering in a language Lily couldn't understand, her voice low and guttural. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Lily's breath became visible in the icy air. "Emily?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. Emily's head snapped towards her, eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She lunged at Lily, who barely managed to dodge her. Terrified, Lily ran back to her room, barricading the door with whatever she could find. She spent the night huddled under her blankets, listening to the eerie silence of the apartment. The next day, Emily seemed completely normal, acting as if nothing had happened. When Lily tried to bring up the previous night's events, Emily looked confused and concerned for her sanity. Lily felt trapped, unsure if she was losing her mind or if something truly sinister was at play. Over the following weeks, Emily's behavior grew more erratic. She started talking to herself, and Lily often found her writing strange symbols on the walls. Lily's sleep was plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures and whispered threats. The sense of dread in the apartment grew, suffocating Lily with its malevolence. Lily considered moving out, but she was strapped for cash and the rent was cheap. The apartment was in a convenient location, and she couldn't afford to move somewhere else on her current salary. So she stayed, hoping things would eventually get better, but they only got worse. One night, Lily woke up in the middle of the night to find Emily sitting on the edge of her bed, smiling eerily. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, and her smile seemed to stretch unnaturally across her face. Lily's heart raced as she stared at Emily, who simply continued to smile without saying a word. Paralyzed by fear, Lily didn't move until Emily finally stood up and left the room, leaving Lily to question whether it was a dream or reality. Another night, Lily went to the bathroom and found Emily sitting on the floor, her face covered by her long, dark hair. She was weeping and sobbing softly. Concerned, Lily approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder. The moment she touched Emily, the bathroom door slammed shut and locked by itself. Emily's sobbing turned into a blood-curdling scream as she lifted her head, revealing a grotesquely disoriented and ghost-like face. Lily stumbled back, frantically trying to unlock the door, but it wouldn't budge. The lights flickered, and when they came back on, Emily was gone, and the door swung open easily. One evening, as Lily was preparing dinner, she heard a soft humming coming from Emily's room. She crept closer, the humming growing louder and more discordant. Peering through the crack in the door, she saw Emily sitting in a circle of candles, her eyes rolled back in her head. The room was filled with the acrid smell of burning herbs, and a dark figure loomed behind her. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, but the floorboard creaked under her weight. Emily's head snapped towards the door, and the dark figure seemed to turn its gaze on Lily. Panic surged through her, and she fled to her room, locking the door behind her. As she frantically dialed 911, the lights in her room flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, and Lily could hear heavy footsteps approaching her door. The line went dead, leaving her in a silence broken only by her ragged breathing. The doorknob rattled, and Lily's terror reached a fever pitch. She scrambled to her closet, hiding among the clothes, her eyes fixed on the door. The door creaked open, and she saw Emily's silhouette in the doorway, illuminated by the flickering candlelight from the hallway. Emily stepped into the room, her movements unnaturally jerky. She held a knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light. Lily's breath caught in her throat as Emily moved closer, her eyes scanning the room. Lily's heart raced as she watched Emily searching the room. She tried to stay as quiet as possible, but her breathing was loud in her ears. Emily's eyes seemed to linger on the closet door for a moment before she turned away, moving towards the window. Taking advantage of the moment, Lily quietly slipped out of the closet and crept towards the door. Emily's back was turned, and Lily's heart pounded as she tiptoed out of the room. She made her way down the hallway towards the basement door. The basement was the only place she could think of that might offer some protection. She reached the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the lock. Finally, she managed to open it and slipped inside, closing the door behind her. She descended the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the darkness. The basement was cold and damp, and the air smelled musty. She found a small window and tried to open it, but it was stuck. Desperation set in as she tugged at the window, praying it would budge. Suddenly, she heard Emily's voice from above. "Lily, where are you?" The voice was soft and sing-song, but it sent chills down Lily's spine. She could hear Emily moving through the house, searching for her. Lily's hands trembled as she finally managed to open the window. She squeezed through the narrow opening, scraping her arms and legs in the process. She dropped to the ground outside, the cool night air hitting her like a wave. She ran through the backyard, her heart pounding. She didn't stop until she reached the street, where she flagged down a passing car. The driver, a concerned older man, took one look at her and called the police. When the police arrived, they searched the apartment but found no trace of Emily or the dark figure. The candles were gone, the strange symbols erased. It was as if nothing had happened. Lily moved out the next day, too terrified to stay another night in the apartment. She found a new place to live, far away from the city, and tried to put the nightmare behind her. But the fear never fully left her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Emily's glowing eyes and heard the dark figure's whispered threats. She lived in constant fear, always looking over her shoulder, never able to fully escape the horror that had taken over her life.
Next story.
Anna was at her wit's end. Months of job searching had yielded nothing but rejection emails. Bills were piling up, and she was desperate. So when she stumbled upon a job listing for a personal assistant with a high salary and flexible hours, it felt like a godsend. The listing was vague but intriguing. seeking a highly motivated individual for an exclusive personal assistant position. Excellent pay. Room and board included. Anna hesitated for a moment, but then sent off a resume, hoping for the best. To her surprise, she received a response within the hour. The email invited her to an interview at an old mansion on the outskirts of town. The location was odd, but desperation overruled her caution. The next day, Anna drove out to the mansion. It was an imposing structure, shrouded in mist and flanked by ancient trees. The iron gates creaked open as she approached, sending a shiver down her spine. She parked her car and walked up to the grand entrance, feeling a sense of foreboding. She was greeted by a tall, pale man named Mr. Thorne, who introduced himself as the head of the household. His eyes were cold and calculating, but his smile was warm and inviting. He led her through the dimly lit corridors to a lavish sitting room where the interview would take place. As they sat down, Anna noticed strange symbols etched into the walls and odd artifacts displayed on the shelves. Mr. Thorne's questions were standard at first, but soon took a bizarre turn. He asked about her beliefs, her willingness to obey orders without question, and her thoughts on loyalty and secrecy. Anna's unease grew with each question. Despite the odd nature of the interview, Anna was offered the job on the spot. She hesitated but then accepted, thinking of her empty bank account. Mr. Thorne seemed pleased and instructed her to move into the mansion immediately. Room and board were part of the job, after all. That night, Anna settled into her new quarters. The room was luxurious but felt more like a gilded cage. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As she lay in bed, she heard whispers outside her door. She peeked out to see Mr. Thorne and several others in dark robes, chanting in a language she couldn't understand. Over the next few days, Anna's duties became increasingly strange. She was asked to clean rooms filled with bizarre relics, prepare elaborate meals for unseen guests, and attend midnight gatherings where hooded figures performed eerie rituals. Her anxiety grew, and she realized she needed to get out. One evening, Anna overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Mr. Thorne was discussing a ceremony that would take place in 3 days. The details were murky, but it was clear that she was to be the central figure. Panic set in, and Anna knew she had to escape. That night, she packed a small bag and waited until the mansion was silent. She slipped out of her room and crept through the dark hallways, heart pounding. She reached the main door, only to find it locked. She frantically searched for another exit, but every window and door was sealed shut. Suddenly, a cold hand clamped over her mouth, and she was dragged backward into a dark room. She struggled, but the grip was too strong. She was blindfolded and tied to a chair. Hours passed, and she could hear murmured conversations around her, the words too muffled to understand. When the blindfold was finally removed, she found herself in a dimly lit room, surrounded by robed figures. Mr. Thorne stood before her, smiling wickedly. "Welcome to the initiation, Anna," he said. "You will play an essential role in our ritual." The cult members forced her to drink a foul-tasting liquid that made her head spin. They led her to a large, ornate chamber where she was chained to the wall. The ceremony began with chanting and the burning of incense that filled the air with a suffocating aroma. Anna's heart pounded in her chest as she realized she was trapped, helpless, and unable to escape. Days blurred together as she was kept in the chamber, fed only enough to keep her alive. Her spirit broke, and she spent hours crying, feeling utterly powerless. Then, on the night of the ceremony, she was dragged to the center of the mansion's grand hall. The cult members explained that she would be the prey in a hunting game. They would release her and give her a head start before hunting her down. Terrified and barefoot, Anna was pushed into the darkness of the vast mansion. She ran through the winding hallways, the cold marble floors biting into her feet. The mansion was a maze of rooms and corridors, each filled with ominous shadows. She could hear the cult members behind her, their footsteps echoing through the halls. Anna found a small closet and squeezed inside, trying to control her ragged breathing. She could hear Mr. Thorne and another cult member searching nearby, their voices low and menacing. "She can't have gone far," Mr. Thorne said. "Spread out and find her. The ritual must be completed." Anna held her breath as they passed by, the light from their torches casting eerie shadows through the cracks in the door. When the footsteps faded, she quietly slipped out and continued her desperate search for an escape. She hid behind heavy drapes, under tables, and in empty rooms, each time narrowly avoiding capture. Her heart raced, and she fought to keep her sobs silent. The fear and exhaustion were overwhelming, but the instinct to survive kept her moving. In one harrowing moment, she hid in a grand library, wedging herself between towering bookshelves. She watched through the gaps as cult members swept the room, their shadows dancing on the walls. One of them paused, inches from her hiding spot, and Anna bit her lip to stifle a scream. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity as Anna evaded her pursuers. She finally found a small, hidden staircase leading to the attic. She climbed up and hid among the dusty old furniture and forgotten relics, praying they wouldn't find her. The attic was stifling, and Anna's tears mingled with the sweat on her face. She could hear the cult members below, their frustration growing. She knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. Summoning her last reserves of strength, she decided to make a run for it. She quietly descended the stairs and slipped through the dark hallways, heading for a window she had noticed earlier. It was high off the ground, but it was her only chance. She climbed onto a table and pushed the window open, slipping out into the cold night air. Anna ran across the grounds, her bare feet bleeding from the rough terrain. She reached the road and flagged down a passing car, a sense of relief washing over her when the driver stopped. The man introduced himself as David and offered to take her to safety. As they drove, Anna explained her ordeal. David listened intently, his face a mask of concern. But when they passed the turn-off for the nearest police station, Anna's unease returned. David's demeanor shifted, and he revealed a sinister smile. "You really thought you could escape, didn't you?" he said, his voice dripping with malice. Anna's heart sank as David turned the car around, driving her back to the mansion. She was dragged back inside, where the cult members awaited her return. She was held captive once more, this time under even tighter security. Despair consumed her, and she felt all hope slipping away. The cult decided to give her another chance to play the game, as she had broken the rule by escaping the mansion. This time, they kept her under strict watch, making escape seem impossible. The night before the game, Lydia, the servant who had shown pity before, approached Anna in secret. Lydia whispered, "I can help you escape again, but we have to be very careful." That night, Lydia led Anna through a hidden passageway in the mansion. They moved silently, hearts pounding with fear of discovery. They emerged in the backyard, where Lydia handed Anna a pair of old shoes. "Run, and don't look back," Lydia urged. Anna ran, her feet carrying her through the forest once more. She reached the highway, and this time she was more cautious about seeking help. She eventually found a truck driver who believed her story and took her to the nearest police station. The police raided the mansion again, but once more the cult had vanished, leaving behind only traces of their dark rituals. Anna was placed in a witness protection program, given a new identity and a chance to start over. The memory of those cold eyes and sinister whispers haunted her dreams, but she was determined to move forward. And that's the chilling tale of the shady job interview, a cult escape. Remember, not all opportunities are as they seem, and sometimes the price of desperation is far too high.
Next story.
It was a quiet Wednesday evening when Jennifer decided to hit the gym for a late-night workout. The gym, located in the heart of the city, was her sanctuary. With the usual crowd gone, she relished the solitude. As she entered, she noticed the lady at the front desk was missing. The gym felt unusually empty, but she shrugged it off, eager to start her routine. Jennifer started with some cardio, the sound of her feet hitting the treadmill echoing in the large, vacant space. After a while, she moved to the weights section. The sense of being watched began to creep over her, an uncomfortable prickling at the back of her neck. She paused, looking around the gym, but saw nothing unusual. Dismissing the feeling, she continued her workout. However, the unease grew stronger, gnawing at her. She decided to finish early and headed towards the locker room. The silence was oppressive, broken only by her footsteps. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Jennifer's breath caught in her throat. She fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam of light revealed the empty lockers. She moved quickly, grabbing her things, but then she heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like someone trying to muffle their footsteps. Her heart pounded in her chest. Realizing something was terribly wrong, she hid under a bench, pressing herself against the cold floor. She saw the feet of the stalker moving slowly through the gym, a rod in his hand. Jennifer's tears welled up, and she bit her lip to keep from sobbing aloud. The stalker's footsteps echoed menacingly as he checked the bathrooms. Seizing the moment, Jennifer slipped out from under the bench and made her way to the pool area. The pool was eerily still, the water reflecting the dim light. She slipped into the pool, hoping the water would hide her. Little did she know, the stalker saw her slipping into the pool and pretended not to notice. Jennifer stayed underwater, heart pounding in her ears. When she resurfaced, gasping for air, she saw the stalker standing in front of her. Panic surged through her, and she jumped back into the pool. The stalker followed, but as Jennifer was an excellent swimmer, she swam fast and exited the pool before him. Her relief was short-lived as she slipped on the wet ground, falling hard. The stalker struggled to exit the pool, his heavy clothes weighing him down. He groaned in frustration. As she got up and tried to run, she heard his eerie laughter echoing through the gym. Jennifer's heart raced as she spotted the storage room. She darted inside, locking the door behind her. Desperate, she found a small window and climbed out, jumping to the ground below. She landed awkwardly, pain shooting through her ankle. She struggled to walk, every step a battle, but she forced herself to keep moving towards her car. Reaching her car, she fumbled with the keys, finally getting in. She locked the doors, started the engine, and sped away. Relief washed over her as she drove through the city streets, putting distance between herself and the gym. When she reached home, she burst into tears, the terror of the night overwhelming her. She told everything to her father, who immediately called the police. When the police arrived at the gym, they discovered the front desk lady was missing, and her family was also worried about her. The gym's security cameras had their data deleted, leaving no evidence of what transpired. Jennifer felt a momentary relief, but knew she would never feel truly safe again. She decided never to go to the gym at night again. As she settled in for the night, exhausted and still shaken, she felt a lingering unease. The adrenaline began to wear off, and she sobbed until she fell into an uneasy sleep. In the middle of the night, Jennifer awoke to a soft scraping sound. Her heart leapt into her throat as she realized it was coming from her bedroom window. She turned her head slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. The shadowy figure of the stalker was there, trying to pry the window open. Tears streamed down her face as she stifled a scream, her body trembling uncontrollably. She bolted from her bed, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and ran to her parents' room. She burst through the door, sobbing uncontrollably. Her father jumped out of bed, alarmed, and rushed to her room. As Jennifer huddled with her mother, shaking and crying, she heard a scuffle from her room. Her father returned, pale and shaken, holding a bag the stalker had dropped. Inside were sinister items, duct tape, rope, and a knife. Jennifer's blood ran cold. The realization of the stalker's intentions left her in utter shock. The police were called again, but there was no proper evidence to trace the stalker. The police assured Jennifer and her family that they would increase patrolling in the area. They also revealed that the front desk lady's body had been found in one of the gym's bathroom stalls. They were actively looking for the killer. Jennifer knew she would never feel safe again. The events of that night haunted her, and she realized the nightmare was far from over. Thank you for joining us for this spine-chilling story. Remember, always be aware of your surroundings, especially when you're alone. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe, like, and comment. Your support helps us bring you more thrilling tales.
Next story.
It was a warm summer evening when Ashley decided to go for a walk in the woods. She needed some time alone, a break from the chaos of her daily life. The sun had just set, casting an orange glow over the trees as she made her way deeper into the forest. The path was familiar, a place she had often visited during the day, but this time felt different. The looming darkness added an eerie atmosphere that sent shivers down her spine. As she walked, Ashley couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl seemed amplified in the quiet of the night. She took a deep breath, convincing herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But then she heard a faint whisper carried by the wind, calling her name. Ashley. She stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around but saw nothing but shadows. The whisper came again, closer this time. Panic set in as she realized she wasn't alone. She turned back the way she came, picking up her pace. The path seemed longer than she remembered, and the trees closed in around her, making it hard to see. Ashley, don't run. The voice was clearer now, almost taunting. She broke into a sprint, her feet pounding against the forest floor. She could hear footsteps behind her, gaining on her. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed herself to go faster. She stumbled over a root, falling hard to the ground. Pain shot through her ankle, but she forced herself up, limping as she continued to flee. The footsteps were right behind her now. She could hear heavy breathing, feel the presence of someone or something closing in. In a desperate attempt to escape, she veered off the path, diving into the thick underbrush. She found a hollowed-out tree and crawled inside, curling up and trying to quiet her breathing. She could hear the footsteps stop nearby. The whisper came again, menacing and filled with malice. Ashley, I know you're here. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to stay silent. She could see a pair of shoes through the gap in the tree, inches from where she was hiding. The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity, before finally moving on. She waited, not daring to move until she was sure the danger had passed. When she finally crawled out, the forest was silent again. She knew she had to get out of there, but her injured ankle made it difficult to walk. She limped through the woods, praying to find her way back. The darkness seemed to close in around her, and every shadow looked like a lurking figure. After what felt like hours, she saw a faint light in the distance. Hope surged through her as she made her way toward it. She emerged from the woods, finding herself at a small cabin. She banged on the door, desperate for help. An elderly man opened the door, his eyes widening at the sight of her. "What happened to you, child?" "Please, help me," she sobbed. "Someone is out there. They were chasing me. He ushered her inside, locking the door behind her. You're safe now. No one can get in here. She collapsed onto a chair, exhaustion taking over. The man brought her some water and tended to her ankle. As she calmed down, she told him everything that had happened. He listened intently, a grave expression on his face. You were lucky to get away, he said. The woods are dangerous at night. Many have gone in and never come out. She shivered at his words, grateful to be alive. As she relaxed in the cabin, the elderly man, who introduced himself as John, prepared some tea. Ashley felt a bit more at ease, her heartbeat returning to normal. She looked around the cozy interior, noticing the rustic decor and the comforting warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. John excused himself to use the restroom, and Ashley took the opportunity to explore the cabin a bit. She wandered into the small bedroom, curiosity piquing her interest. The room was modest, with a single bed covered in a quilt. Her eyes were drawn to something peeking out from under the bed. She knelt down and pulled out a dusty old chest. Opening it, she gasped. Inside were an array of unsettling items, rusty knives, an old saw, ropes, and what looked like various tools and equipment, including rolls of duct tape, causing her to recoil in fear. Her heart pounded in her chest as she quickly pushed the chest back under the bed. She stood up, her mind racing. She had to get out of there. She crept back to the main room, trying to keep her breathing steady. John was still in the restroom. She tiptoed to the front door and tried the handle. It was locked. Panic surged through her as she looked around for another escape route. The windows were small and barred, impossible to squeeze through. John emerged from the restroom, smiling warmly. Everything all right, dear? Ashley forced a smile, trying to hide her fear. Yes, thank you. I was just wondering if I could get some fresh air. John's expression darkened slightly. Oh, the door is locked for your safety. The woods can be dangerous at night, you know. She nodded, swallowing hard. Of course. I understand. Her mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. She needed to get away, but how? She glanced at the old rotary phone on the wall, but doubted it would work. Desperation clawed at her as she realized how truly trapped she was. John returned to the kitchen, humming a tune as he prepared the tea. Ashley's eyes darted around the room, searching desperately for anything she could use as a weapon. Her gaze settled on a heavy candlestick on the mantel. As she edged toward it, her heart pounded in her ears. Then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The shoes John was wearing were the same ones she had seen earlier, when she was hiding in the hollowed-out tree. Just as she reached for the candlestick, John turned around. Why don't you sit down and relax? Ashley, you look pale. She froze, her fingers brushing the cold metal. I'm fine, just a little shaken up from earlier. He walked over, his eyes narrowing slightly. You know, Ashley, it's dangerous to go snooping around in someone else's home. Her blood ran cold. I don't know what you're talking about. He stepped closer, a sinister smile playing on his lips. You found the chest, didn't you? Ashley's breath caught in her throat. She lunged for the candlestick, but John was quicker. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully until she dropped the makeshift weapon. She cried out, trying to pull away, but his grip was like iron. Let me go, she screamed, tears streaming down her face. John dragged her to the bedroom, throwing her onto the bed. I was hoping you'd be smarter than this, Ashley, he said, his voice cold. But it seems you need to be taught a lesson. He reached under the bed, pulling out the chest. Ashley scrambled back, pressing herself against the headboard. John opened the chest, pulling out a knife. He ran his finger along the blade, his eyes never leaving hers. You should have stayed in the woods, he said softly. Now, you're mine. Ashley's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. She watched John carefully, waiting for any opportunity to escape. He approached her slowly, the knife gleaming in the dim light. Just as he reached the edge of the bed, she kicked out with all her strength, hitting him square in the chest. John stumbled back, momentarily winded. Ashley seized the chance, leaping off the bed and bolting for the door. She twisted the handle frantically, but it wouldn't budge. She turned just in time to see John lunging at her. She ducked, and he crashed into the door, giving her a split second to run. She darted into the kitchen, grabbing a heavy frying pan. John recovered quickly, stalking after her with a murderous gleam in his eyes. She swung the pan as hard as she could, connecting with his head. Ashley didn't wait to see if he got up. She ran to the back of the cabin, finding a small window in the bathroom. She smashed it with the frying pan, ignoring the pain as the glass cut her hands. She squeezed through the narrow opening, falling to the ground outside. She got to her feet, adrenaline fueling her as she ran into the woods. Behind her, she could hear John shouting, but she didn't look back. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like they would give out. Finally, she stumbled upon a road. She waved frantically at an approaching car, tears streaming down her face. The car stopped, and a middle-aged woman got out, concern etched on her face. "Are you all right?" the woman asked. Ashley nodded, still trembling. "Please, help me. Someone is after me," she sobbed. "He's back there in the woods." The woman quickly helped Ashley into the car and locked the doors. "Don't worry, sweetheart, you're safe now. I'll take you to the nearest police station." As the car sped away, Ashley looked back, half expecting to see John bursting out of the trees. But the woods remained eerily silent, the cabin hidden in the shadows. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. At the police station, Ashley recounted her harrowing experience to the officers. They took her statement seriously and immediately dispatched a team to search the cabin and the surrounding woods. Ashley was taken to a hospital for treatment of her injuries and allowed to rest. The next day, an officer visited her room with news. "We found the cabin," he said, "but John was gone. We did find the chest you described, along with other disturbing evidence. It looks like he's been doing this for a long time. We'll do everything we can to find him." Ashley shivered, remembering the sinister look in John's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the hospital blanket tightly. Weeks passed, and Ashley tried to return to her normal life, though the nightmares plagued her sleep. She couldn't shake the feeling that John was still out there, watching, waiting for another chance. The police increased patrols around her home, and she took every precaution to ensure her safety. One evening, as she sat in her living room, the phone rang. She answered it, and a familiar voice sent chills down her spine. "Ashley," John whispered, "you can't hide from me forever." The line went dead. Ashley dropped the phone, her hands shaking. She realized that her ordeal was far from over. John was still out there, and he would stop at nothing to find her.
Next story.
It was a quiet evening in the small town of Arizona. Christina, a 19-year-old college student, was home alone. Her parents had gone out of town for the weekend, and she decided to use this opportunity to catch up on her studies and enjoy some peace and quiet. Little did she know, her night was about to take a horrifying turn. Around 10 p.m., Christina was in her bedroom, finishing up an essay for her psychology class. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. She found solace in the stillness, the only company being the soft hum of her desk lamp. As she typed away, she suddenly heard a faint noise coming from downstairs. It sounded like a door creaking open. Christina paused, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. She listened intently, convincing herself that it was probably just the wind or the house settling. But then she heard it again, louder this time. Her heart began to race. She slowly stood up and crept towards her bedroom door. Peeking out into the hallway, she saw nothing out of the ordinary. Determined to prove to herself that it was nothing, Christina decided to investigate. She tiptoed down the stairs, her eyes scanning the darkness. As she reached the bottom, she saw the front door slightly ajar. Panic surged through her veins. She knew she had locked it earlier. Just as she was about to close the door, she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the shadows of the living room, was a tall, menacing figure. His eyes glinted with a sinister light, and a twisted smile spread across his face. Christina's mind went blank with terror. She bolted towards the nearest room, the washroom, slamming the door shut behind her. She locked it quickly and backed away, her hands trembling. She could hear the intruder's footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. Desperately, she tried to stifle her sobs, pressing her hands over her mouth. The doorknob rattled, and the intruder began to pound on the door. "Come out, little girl," he taunted, his voice dripping with malice. Christina's heart was pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She glanced around the small washroom, looking for anything she could use to defend herself. Outside, the pounding grew more intense, and then suddenly it stopped. Silence filled the air, but Christina knew better than to assume he had left. She stayed perfectly still, straining to hear any sign of movement. Minutes felt like hours, and just as she began to relax, the door burst open with a deafening crash. Christina screamed and darted past the intruder, her adrenaline fueling her escape. She ran through the house, tears streaming down her face. She could hear him laughing behind her, a sound that would haunt her nightmares for years to come. She made it to the front door, flung it open, and sprinted into the night. She ran helplessly, her feet barely touching the ground as she fled down the dark, empty streets. She didn't stop until she reached the nearest neighbor's house, banging frantically on the door. The neighbor, a kind elderly woman, let her in and called the police. The police arrived quickly, but the intruder was nowhere to be found. They searched the house and the surrounding area, but came up empty-handed. Christina was left shaken and terrified, knowing that the man who had invaded her home was still out there. The days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such a traumatic event. Christina couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every creak of the house, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. One night, weeks after the initial incident, Christina was asleep in her bed when she felt a presence in her room. Her eyes snapped open, and she saw the intruder standing over her. Before she could scream, he clamped a hand over her mouth and whispered, "Did you miss me?" Christina struggled, but he was too strong. He dragged her out of bed and carried her to his car, parked just outside her window. He threw her into the back seat, tying her hands and feet with rough, coarse rope. She could see the madness in his eyes, the pleasure he took in her fear. The car sped off into the night, taking her far from the safety of her home. He took her to an abandoned cabin in the woods, where he kept her captive. Days turned into a blur of terror and pain. He enjoyed watching her suffer, taking pleasure in her screams and tears. As the days went by, the intruder would talk to Christina, revealing the twisted depths of his mind. He told her how he hated beautiful women because they reminded him of his mother, who had abandoned him as a child. His voice would take on a sickly sweet tone as he described his mother's cruelty and his desire to make all beautiful women suffer as he had. "You think you're so special, don't you?" he would sneer, pacing the small cabin. "All you beautiful women, always thinking you're better than everyone else. My mother was like that. She left me to rot, and now you'll pay for her sins." He kept Christina tied to a wooden chair, her wrists and ankles bound tightly with rope. The cabin was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small, flickering candle on a rickety table. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. Christina's body ached from the constant strain of being tied up, and her mind was in a perpetual state of fear and despair. Despite the terror, Christina knew she had to escape. She carefully observed her surroundings, looking for any opportunity to free herself. She noticed a sharp piece of metal sticking out from one of the cabin's wooden beams. It was within reach, but she had to wait for the right moment when the intruder wasn't around. One night, while the intruder was out in the forest, Christina seized her chance. She scooted the chair closer to the beam, her heart pounding in her chest. She began to rub the ropes against the metal, feeling them gradually fray. After what felt like hours, the ropes finally snapped. Christina quickly untied her ankles, her hands shaking with urgency. She crept out of the cabin, each step cautious and deliberate. The forest was dark and eerie, the only light coming from the moon above. She moved as quietly as she could, every twig snapping underfoot making her wince. She knew he was out there somewhere, but she had no choice but to risk it. As she made her way through the dense trees, she heard a rustling behind her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The intruder was close. She could hear his footsteps, his voice calling out for her. She began to run, her fear giving her speed. She ran blindly, her only goal to get as far away as possible. Just when she thought she couldn't run any longer, she stumbled onto a dirt road. She saw headlights approaching and waved frantically. The car screeched to a halt, and a middle-aged man stepped out, looking alarmed. "Help me, please," Christina cried, her voice hoarse from screaming. The man didn't hesitate. He ushered her into the car and sped off, leaving the intruder behind. Christina looked back and saw him standing at the edge of the road, a look of pure rage on his face. The man drove her to the nearest police station, where she was finally safe. The police launched a massive search for the intruder, but once again, he vanished without a trace. Christina was left with the scars of her ordeal, but she was alive. This terrifying tale serves as a reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows. Christina's story is one of survival against unimaginable odds. Thank you for joining me in this chilling journey. If you enjoyed this suspenseful tale, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more gripping stories like this.
Next story.
Eliza sat in her dimly lit bedroom, the only illumination coming from her laptop screen. It was late at night, and the silence of her suburban home was punctuated by the occasional creak of the house settling. She had always been curious, a trait that served her well in her schoolwork, but often led her down rabbit holes on the internet. Tonight, she was venturing into one of the deepest rabbit holes, the dark web. She had heard whispers about it from her friends, tales of hidden marketplaces, conspiracy theories, and unspeakable horrors. With her parents asleep and her homework completed, she felt an urge to explore. Using a Tor browser, she navigated through layers of encryption, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. She stumbled upon a forum called The Lullaby Room, a place where users shared stories and experiences that sent shivers down her spine. One post caught her eye. Experience true fear live chat with hackers. The thread was filled with warnings and pleas to avoid it, but Eliza's curiosity got the better of her. She clicked the link, entered the chat room, and typed a simple greeting. "Hello?" The response was instantaneous. "Welcome, Eliza. We've been expecting you." She froze. How did they know her name? Panic set in as she considered closing the browser, but before she could move, another message appeared. Don't even think about leaving." Her heart pounded as she watched the cursor blink on the screen. "Who are you?" she typed, her hands trembling. "We are the keepers of the shadows," the reply came. "You wanted to see the dark web. Now you will experience it." Suddenly, her screen flickered, and a series of images flashed before her eyes: her home, her school, her friends. It was as if someone had been watching her, documenting her every move. "We know everything about you," the message continued. "And now we control your life." From that night on, Eliza's life became a waking nightmare. Her phone rang with strange numbers at all hours, and when she answered, there was nothing but heavy breathing or eerie laughter on the other end. Her social media accounts were hacked, and personal photos and messages were posted for the world to see. Friends and family received emails from her account, filled with cruel and bizarre content, straining her relationships and isolating her. At school, things were worse. Eliza's grades plummeted as her focus shifted to merely surviving each day. Rumors spread about her, fueled by the hacker's relentless torment. She became the subject of bullying, her former friends avoiding her like the plague. She tried to explain her situation to her parents, but they thought it was a cry for attention. The authorities were of little help, dismissing her claims as the antics of bored teenagers. Desperate, Eliza turned to online forums, hoping someone could offer a solution, but every lead turned into a dead end. The hacker seemed omnipotent, always one step ahead. Eliza's life spiraled further into chaos. Her nightmares became more vivid, often featuring the hooded figures she imagined were behind the screen. Sleep-deprived and paranoid, she could hardly differentiate between dreams and reality. The walls of her room seemed to close in on her, the shadows morphing into grotesque shapes. One night, she received an email with a subject line that chilled her to the bone: "Your last chance." The email contained a single sentence: "Meet us or the nightmare continues." Attached was an address in a rundown part of town. Against her better judgment, Eliza decided to go. She had nothing left to lose and needed answers. Dressed in a hoodie and jeans, she took a bus to the address, a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The area was eerily quiet, the only sound of footsteps echoing in the empty street. Inside the warehouse, she found a single chair under a flickering light. As she approached, figures emerged from the shadows: 3 people, their faces hidden behind masks. One of them stepped forward and handed her a laptop. "Sit," a voice commanded. Trembling, she obeyed. The screen lit up with a live video feed of her parents, tied to chairs in their living room. "We control everything," the masked figure said. "Your life, your family, your fate. This is your final test." Tears streamed down Eliza's face. "Please, just let them go," she begged. "Play the game, and they might be spared," the figure replied. The game was a twisted series of puzzles and challenges, each more horrifying than the last. Eliza's mind raced as she tried to solve them, each mistake resulting in the masked figures tightening their grip on her parents. Hours passed, the tension mounting, until she reached the final challenge. "Choose," the figure said. "Save yourself or save your parents." With shaking hands, Eliza made her choice. "I choose my parents," she whispered. The figures laughed, a cold, heartless sound. "Wrong choice," the leader said. Suddenly, the lights went out. Eliza's laptop screen went black, and she felt rough hands grabbing her, pulling her out of the chair. She screamed, but a cloth was pressed over her mouth, and the world faded to darkness. When she awoke, she was in a dank, dimly lit basement. Her hands and feet were bound, and a gag was tied tightly around her mouth. Panic set in as she realized she was completely alone. The only sound was the distant drip of water echoing in the dark. Days turned into a blur of fear and pain. The masked figures returned periodically, taunting her, making her solve more puzzles under duress. They delighted in her suffering, feeding off her terror. Eliza's spirit waned, her hope dwindling with each passing hour. One night, she heard footsteps approaching. A hooded figure entered the room, but this time the voice was different. "Eliza," it whispered, "don't make a sound. I'm here to help." It was her friend, Sarah, who had been suspicious of Eliza's sudden disappearance. Using her own tech skills, Sarah had tracked down the location of the warehouse. She had been planning this rescue for days, waiting for the right moment. Sarah quickly untied Eliza, who was too weak to stand on her own. Supporting her friend, Sarah led her through a series of dark corridors, avoiding the patrolling guards. The warehouse was a maze, and every creak of the floorboards made their hearts race. They finally reached an exit, but just as they stepped outside, an alarm blared. The hackers had discovered the escape. They sprinted across the gravel lot, Eliza barefoot and stumbling, her feet bleeding from the sharp stones. Just as the guards closed in, Sarah's older brother, who had been waiting nearby with a getaway car, sped toward them. The girls dove into the back seat, and the car roared to life, speeding away from the nightmare. Eliza and her parents were saved, but the scars ran deep. Therapy and the support of friends and family were crucial in her recovery, but she knew she would never be the same. The dark web had shown her the depths of human depravity, and the experience haunted her dreams. The dark web's lullaby was a haunting melody she would never forget, a reminder that sometimes curiosity can be the most dangerous path of all.
Next story.
Harper lived a life of constant scrutiny under the watchful eyes of her overbearing parents. Their strict rules and suffocating control made her feel trapped, like a bird in a cage. Her only solace was Jake, her long-distance boyfriend, who promised her a life of freedom and love. They made a plan. She would leave her home at night and move in with him in his distant city. On a cold, moonless night, Harper packed her belongings into a small backpack and slipped out of her house. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and excitement as she met Jake at the bus station. He was waiting for her, smiling reassuringly. Little did she know, she was stepping into a nightmare far worse than her life at home. Jake's house was hidden deep in the woods, isolated and surrounded by dense forest. As they drove further from civilization, Harper's unease grew. The house itself was old and dilapidated, with a sinister aura that made her skin crawl. Jake's demeanor changed the moment they arrived. The warmth in his eyes turned cold and predatory, and Harper's hope quickly turned to dread. Days turned into weeks, and Harper's life became a living hell. Jake was not the caring boyfriend she thought he was. He was a psychotic sadist who took pleasure in her suffering. He kept her captive, threatening her daily and delighting in her fear. "You thought you could escape your prison and come to me for freedom?" Jake sneered. "You're mine now, Harper. Your suffering gives me power. You are nothing without me." Harper's days were filled with relentless torment. Jake tied her up, both physically and mentally, and reveled in her helplessness. He would sit close to her, whispering cruel words in her ear, telling her how worthless she was and how no one cared about her. He enjoyed punishing her, claiming it was his way of showing love. His punishments were brutal, ranging from psychological torment to physical abuse. One night, after a particularly brutal beating, Jake revealed his true intentions. "I've done this before, you know," he said with a sinister smile. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last. I enjoy watching the light leave their eyes." Harper's blood ran cold. She realized she was not just a captive, but a part of Jake's twisted game. She knew she had to escape, but the fear of being caught paralyzed her. Weeks passed, and Harper's hope dwindled. Jake's taunts grew more sinister, his methods more cruel. He would deprive her of food and water, leaving her weak and delirious. He played mind games, making her doubt her own sanity. Harper's once strong spirit was slowly being crushed. One night, as Jake slept, Harper decided it was now or never. She had spent weeks studying the locks and the chains, and she had managed to loosen one of her restraints. Her hands trembled as she quietly worked the chain free. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence, and her heart pounded in her chest. Once free, she moved cautiously, trying to stop her sobbing. The fear of being caught made her movements slow and deliberate. She crept through the dark house, avoiding the creaky floorboards, her breath shallow and quick. She reached the front door, only to find it locked from the outside. As she turned around, Jake was standing there, his eyes filled with rage. "Trying to leave, are we?" he hissed, grabbing her roughly. Harper struggled, tears streaming down her face. In the chaos, she remembered Jake's room had a window. Summoning all her strength, she broke free and ran towards his room. Jake chased after her, but she managed to lock the door behind her. With trembling hands, she shattered the window with a nearby lamp, cutting herself in the process. Harper climbed through the broken window, the jagged glass tearing at her skin. She fell to the ground outside and immediately started running towards the forest. Behind her, she could hear Jake's furious shouts as he followed her. The darkness of the woods was both a blessing and a curse. It hid her, but also made it difficult to navigate. Branches scratched her skin and roots tripped her up, but she kept running, driven by sheer terror. She could hear Jake getting closer, his footsteps pounding against the forest floor. Harper found a large tree and hid behind it, trying to stifle her sobs. She held her breath, listening to Jake's footsteps getting closer. He was so close she could hear his breathing. "Harper, you can't hide from me," he taunted, his voice dripping with malice. "I will find you, and when I do, you'll regret ever trying to leave." Minutes felt like hours as she waited for him to move away. She could hear Jake's voice, filled with mock sorrow. "Harper, why did you leave me? I thought we were happy together. Come back, and I promise I won't hurt you. I love you, Harper. You belong with me." Her heart pounded as she listened to his manipulative words. She knew he was lying, but the fear and desperation gnawed at her resolve. Jake's voice then changed to a menacing growl. "If you don't come out now, Harper, I will make sure your suffering is unimaginable. I will hunt you down, and when I find you, you will wish you had never been born." Harper's breath caught in her throat. She fought the urge to cry out and reveal her hiding spot. She waited until she heard Jake's footsteps move away before she made her next move. She crawled through the underbrush, careful not to make any noise. She found another tree to hide behind and tried to calm her racing heart. Suddenly, she heard Jake sobbing in the distance. His cries were filled with false despair, designed to lure her out. "Harper, please. I can't live without you. I'm sorry for everything. Just come back, and we can be happy again. I promise I'll change." The sobs turned into laughter, cold and mocking. "You can't hide forever, Harper. I know this forest better than you do. You're only making things worse for yourself." Harper's mind raced as she moved from one hiding spot to another, always staying one step ahead of Jake. She could hear him talking to himself, his words a mix of threats and pleas. Why do they always run? Don't they know it's pointless? I will find her. I always do. The forest seemed to close in around her, the darkness pressing in from all sides. She stumbled over roots and rocks, her body aching from exhaustion and fear. She found a small hollow under a fallen tree and crawled inside, trying to steady her breathing. Jake's voice echoed through the trees, closer this time. "Harper, come out, wherever you are. Let's end this little game. You can't win." Her body trembled as she listened to his footsteps drawing nearer. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, the pain grounding her in the moment. She waited until the footsteps faded again before she moved, her movements slow and deliberate. Harper knew she had to get to the highway. She forced herself to keep going, despite the pain and exhaustion. Hours passed as she navigated the forest, always listening for Jake's approach. She finally reached the edge of the forest and saw the highway in the distance. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. There were no cars in sight, and she had to walk barefoot along the rough asphalt. Her feet were cut and bleeding, but she didn't care. She had to get away. Harper walked for miles, her body aching and her spirit nearly broken. Just as she was about to give up, she saw the faint lights of a gas station. Summoning her last ounce of strength, she stumbled towards it. The attendant was shocked by her appearance and immediately called the police. When the authorities arrived, Harper was finally safe. But Jake was never found. Despite the police's efforts, he had vanished without a trace. Harper lived in constant fear, always looking over her shoulder, wondering if he would come back to claim her. The trauma of her ordeal haunted her every waking moment, and she struggled to rebuild her life. But she was free, and that was a victory in itself. The scars, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal, but Harper was determined to survive. Her story serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind seemingly kind eyes and the strength it takes to escape it.
Next story.
It all started on a seemingly ordinary Saturday afternoon. Evelyn, a bright and cheerful 18-year-old girl, accompanied her mother to the local grocery store. They often did their shopping together, chatting about school, friends, and future plans. Little did Evelyn know, this mundane trip would mark the beginning of a terrifying ordeal that would haunt her days and nights. As they strolled through the aisles, Evelyn noticed something unsettling. A man, tall with a disheveled appearance, seemed to be watching her. At first, she dismissed it as a mere coincidence, but as she moved from one aisle to another, his gaze never left her. Her heart began to race, a chill creeping down her spine. She told herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew something was very wrong. Trying to shake off the feeling, Evelyn focused on finding her mother, who had wandered off to the produce section. But the man followed her every step. Panic started to set in. She glanced around, hoping to spot a store employee, but there was no one in sight. The store, once a familiar and safe place, now felt like a maze of terror. Evelyn ducked behind a shelf, trying to hide. Her breath was shaky, her hands trembling. She peeked through the gaps, praying he wouldn't find her. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud and fast, as if it might give away her hiding spot. The man's footsteps grew louder, and she had to bite her lip to stop herself from sobbing out loud. After what felt like an eternity, she gathered the courage to move. She had to find her mom. She couldn't stay hidden forever. Finally, she spotted her mother, blissfully unaware of the danger. Evelyn ran to her, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, we need to go. Now," she whispered urgently. Her mother, sensing the fear in her daughter's voice, didn't ask questions. They left the store in a hurry, but when Evelyn looked back, the man was gone. That night, Evelyn barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind made her jump. She tried to convince herself it was over, that the man was just a figment of her imagination. But deep down, she knew better. The next day, Evelyn tried to go about her normal routine. but the sense of being watched never left her. At school, she saw him standing across the street, staring. On her way home, he was there, lurking in the shadows. Her fear grew with each passing day, the stalker becoming an ever-present specter in her life. Evelyn's world turned into a nightmare. She was constantly looking over her shoulder, her heart pounding every time she stepped outside. She couldn't escape him. Her friends noticed her change in behavior, but she was too scared to tell anyone. She didn't want to sound crazy. Then the messages started. At first, they were just eerie direct messages on Instagram. "You're beautiful, Evelyn. I watch you every day." Her stomach churned with dread as she stared at the screen. Who could be sending these? She blocked the account, hoping that would be the end of it. But it was only the beginning. New accounts began sending her messages. "I can't wait to be with you forever. We belong together." The words were typed in all caps, as if the person was shouting through the screen. It sent chills down her spine. She blocked those accounts too, but the messages kept coming, each new account more disturbing than the last. The messages escalated quickly. "I love the way you smell. I love the way you move. Soon, you'll be mine, Evelyn." She could feel her skin crawl as she read them. She reported the messages to Instagram, but the accounts were deleted before any action could be taken. The fear grew unbearable, suffocating her every waking moment. One evening, as she was walking home from a friend's house, the unimaginable happened. The stalker appeared out of nowhere, grabbing her arm with a vice-like grip. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She tried to scream, but fear choked her voice. Summoning every ounce of strength, she managed to break free and ran as fast as she could, tears blurring her vision. She screamed, her voice finally breaking free, but the streets were empty. There was no one to help her. She burst through her front door, sobbing uncontrollably. Her parents called the police, but by the time they arrived, the stalker was long gone. The police took her statement, but there was little they could do without more evidence. Evelyn felt hopeless, trapped in a never-ending nightmare. That night, Evelyn had a horrifying dream. The stalker was in her room, reaching for her with his twisted smile. She woke up screaming, her parents rushing in to comfort her. The nightmare felt so real, she could still feel his cold grip on her arm. Days turned into weeks, and Evelyn lived in constant fear. The stalker seemed to have disappeared, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching. She avoided going out alone, always staying close to friends and family. But the fear never left her. One evening, as she was watching the news with her parents, her heart nearly stopped. The anchor reported the arrest of a man responsible for multiple kidnappings and murders over the past few years. The mugshot flashed on the screen, and Evelyn's blood ran cold. It was him, the stalker. Relief washed over her, tears streaming down her face. The man who had haunted her dreams and turned her life into a living nightmare was finally behind bars. Evelyn knew she would never forget the terror she experienced, but at least she could finally start to heal. Evelyn's story is a chilling reminder of the dangers that can lurk in the most ordinary places. It's a testament to the strength of the human spirit to survive even the most harrowing ordeals. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and remember to trust your instincts. You never know who might be watching. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of terror. Until next time, stay safe and sleep well.